Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. Yeah, so today our guest is Scott Tannenbaum, and we're going to talk all about teams. We're going to talk about the 7 drivers of team effectiveness and implications for people, leaders, and organizations.
That's right. We are just so thrilled to have Scott Tannenbaum here with us on the Indigo Podcast. And let me properly introduce Scott. So Scott Tannenbaum has worked over 25 years with a variety of companies, providing evidence-based advice and conducting highly cited research on teams, more than 18,000 citations as of recently. And he has done this really across a wide variety, as I mentioned, of settings and challenges. As the president of the Group for Organizational Effectiveness, he has advised hundreds of organizations globally, including more than 75 Fortune and Global 1,000 companies across every major business sector. He's also supported teams that work on oil rigs, parachute into fires, perform surgery, dive undersea, engage in combat, treat cancer, play rugby, and prepare for future space missions. He was named a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, who also honored him with their Distinguished Professional Contributions Award. His latest book, and the subject of today's conversation, is Teams That Work, which was recently published by Oxford University Press. It debuted as the #1 new release in organizational psychology. So, Scott, just a formal welcome to the Indigo Podcast.
Thanks for the invitation. Great to be here.
Awesome. Yes.
This
yes,
is so good.
Let me just say yes. Scott Tannenbaum is in the house. Yes.
Well said, Chris. And before we started this, Chris and I were like, we've been reading your book, Scott, and we started talking to each other this morning about kind of what we were thinking about it, and we both were like, yes, finally a book about teams that is evidence-based and accessible. It's just that, and that's just something that I think is really needed in our in the book marketplace, but certainly in organizations everywhere.
Yeah, there's no fluffy filler here, guys.
That's
sometimes
right.
you get it's not even a long book, 200-300 pages, but could have been an HBR article, and that was it. No, this is money, every chapter by chapter, and this is the exact kind of stuff we look for in books that we use with clients or recommend heartily to other organizations and people. This is all evidence-based stuff.
That's right.
There's no like, oh, maybe this is a good idea, or this just is, oh, it's just an emotional puff piece that'll make you feel good, but not change anything in your life. This is hard-hitting, beef and potatoes, guys.
That's right. So, Scott, why don't you just start us off by telling us a little bit about why did you write this book? There are hundreds, thousands of books about teams. Why?
Yeah, so I'd say for the last 30 years or so, Eduardo Salas, Ed's my co-author, and he's the chair of psychology at Rice University. We've been working with all sorts of teams. You mentioned, a bunch of them. And they had been getting advice, often not particularly helpful advice. And at the same time we were working with them, we started doing research, and the research started becoming clearer and clearer. I think one of the really, neat things we noticed is that globally there's this community of team researchers. And all of a sudden we reached a point where we looked at this body of research and thought about our practice and said, we're finally at a point where we can provide some evidence-based advice. We got excited about that. And we started giving advice, based on that in our practice. And we saw improvements in the teams we worked with. We started giving talks, at associations and at corporations. And every time we were finished, they would say, so do you have a book? Right? Have you written this down? And for several years, Ed and I kind of waffled about it. And we finally said, I think the time is right. And that's what led us to put pen to paper.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And, I guess one thing that you do when you go through the process of putting together a book and a book proposal is trying to identify how it's different from other stuff that's out there. What was kind of the gap that you saw that you thought, we can really fill this particular area?
Yeah, so, a lot of the writing is done by, let's say, I'll call them gurus, right? So it's all experiential based. They'll say things like, well, I was in combat and I learned this, or, in my experience, I saw these things. And some of what they suggested is great, right? Some of it maybe was just innocuous and some of it was just downright wrong, right? So there was this gap in terms of this experience-based approach. And then there were, in academic textbooks and journals, there's some really nice things being written, but they're inaccessible, right? So the niche that we saw was it's time to take some of that hidden research that actually is quite good, but inaccessible, and make it available in some ways to kind of supplement or maybe to counter in some cases the experiential books that were out
there. I think there's just a real famine for this kind of writing. People run into these problems in their day to day. I mean, who is not or has not ever been on a team? Robinson Crusoe, I guess, somebody, right? That somebody else mail in an angry letter and be like, Robinson Crusoe was not on a team, but he did have his man Friday, right? Or whatever. Anyway.
Even Tom Hanks had a soccer ball.
That's right.
You had Wilson.
So we run into these problems every day. The family as a team, our neighborhood teams, the sporting events, the places where we work, and we've all run into problems with this. And rather than just going, I guess that's just life, Scott, you put something as a way forward. And the reason why we can be deceived, I think, by gurus and people that, really shouldn't be talking on a lot of this stuff because they're just making up stuff that sounds nice that isn't helpful, is because there's such a famine in our lives of needing solutions to these problems.
Yeah, and everybody has team experiences, like you mentioned. And less than 25% of people think that their own teams are performing very effectively. So at the same time that we've got this growth and proliferation of all sorts of teams at work, outside of work, we also know that a lot of people are having bad team experiences. And it sucks to be on a bad team. We've all had that experience. You just don't want to be on another team when that happens.
Yeah. One thing that I recall from the book was, you talked about how our prior experiences on teams can influence how we may perceive teams in general and how we may participate in teams in the future. And, going back to the team project, right? So I teach MBA students a lot, and, I sometimes joke with them saying that, okay, we're going to do it. Here's a group project. And, maybe you want to have these people be the pallbearers at your funeral so they can let you down one last time. Right. And they all get it. They all laugh, right? Because we've all been on those teams where there's a lot of social loafing and just issues that come to play. But I guess one place maybe we should start here is tell us a little bit about how the science, how you and Eduardo, when you were writing this book, how do you define a team and how do you think about this thing that we call team effectiveness?
Yeah. So, the academic literature tends to define teams very rigidly, right? People are in roles, define borders, etc. But, when we look at the teams we're working with, that's not always the case. I mean, sometimes in organizational settings, it's a bit more amorphous, right? There's this flow around it. So for us, it's two or more people that have some shared goal or priorities. It doesn't mean they're necessarily all aligned, but some shared goal or priorities. And some degree of interdependence that we can't simply perform independently and expect to be successful. So, a group of people that are working in the same office space are not necessarily a team, right? But the border is not always going to be the case that it's like a football team where you can say, I'm the quarterback, you're the wide receiver. That's not how teams are. It's messier than that now. And for us, a highly effective team is one, obviously, that delivers results over time. I think that's pretty straightforward, right? But if what we do in order to be able to get those results in the short term is we burn out our team, right? So we don't have kind of the vibrancy that we need to go forward. If we're not able to bounce back from challenges and show resilience, it's not a great team, right? Because, we can get a team to kind of do the overnighter once, but, over a period of time, that team is going to struggle. So for us, it's ongoing performance, it's resilience, and it's vitality.
Awesome. And, it's been the talk for many years now, I think, in kind of the popular and to some extent the scholarly conversation around organizational life that, teams are becoming more common, collaborative work is becoming more common. And it seems like, that gives a little bit more, even more of an increased importance, perhaps, to this study of teams and teamwork. And there's still a lot of improvement, as you mentioned, that needs to happen.
Yeah, so there's plenty of data that shows that it's very difficult to be an individual contributor these days, right? To expect that you're going to be able to go through your career as a lone wolf, just leave me the heck alone and I will get things done. Some people have that as a preference, but I like to tell them, unfortunately, that's not the world we're living in. So even for them, they've got to learn how to be able to operate in more of a team setting. I mean, one of the myths that we see, though, is that once leaders start recognizing, the value of teams, they want to put a team on everything, right? They want to form a committee. They want to put a task force together. They want to, and I like to tell them, when you form teams for the wrong reasons, when you form a team for a piece of work that's better done by an individual or maybe a couple of people, folks are going to have a bad experience. You're not going to get the results. And then what happens is they start believing that teams aren't very effective. And so the next time you ask them, they're like, you can pass on me. Why don't you ask Joe to be on the team instead? So we want leaders to be thoughtful about when they form teams. And when they form them for the right reasons, the evidence shows that, that you get great performance from them.
Yeah, share that statistic again about how many people think teams are good.
Yeah, so interesting. This is Leanne Davey shared data that 90% of people view teams as critical to the success of their organizations, and less than 25% believe their own team is highly effective, right? So everyone knows they're important, but just my team's not doing so great.
Yeah, it's like, for that statistic to persist, it had to be like, man, I just keep getting the bummest lottery tickets every single time. It doesn't matter what organization I go to, I get on the numbskull team, the squad of jackwagons.
Yeah, and you have a couple of those experiences and you don't want to be on a team again, right? And it starts in school. Ben, you alluded to this earlier, we get put on a team in school and I've got someone on my team that's really just loafing along. And if we get a bad grade, I'm thinking, man, I can't believe that guy dragged us down. And if we get a good grade, I think, wow, that's unfair that he got a good grade and I didn't, right? And so we know a lot of students, and you know this from the classroom, a lot of students don't want to be on team assignments for those reasons. But the reality is they're going to be on teams for the rest of their career. So if we don't start teaching them in business school, engineering school, medical school, we're providing some advice to medical schools now, to learn how to work in a team, be a good team member and a good team leader early in their career, they're going to not be equipped when they hit the workforce.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
And you've distilled a systematic way to think about it. Most people think, well, and you talk about some of these myths, and we'll get to those in a minute, but it's, okay, don't be a jerk. Okay, I'm a good team member. Maybe we can recruit a good leader. Okay. I mean, we have these kinds of things, but you're like, well, what does a good team member actually look like in the day-to-day? What would make a good team leader? Should we get one of these powerful sociopaths that, are super popular in the business press and slaughter everybody on their team? Well, I don't know if that's it, right? There needs to be a disciplined, step-by-step kind of way of thinking about it. And that's something that you provide here.
Yeah, and the example of that leader, the scorched earth leader, there's an example of someone who might get you to the first deadline, right? But that team cannot sustain performance, right? So, what works for a very short period of time and might be okay, at some point will burn out the team and you're not going to get sustained results.
Yeah, exactly. And one interesting other point that you mentioned in the book, I think that's very important, kind of going back to this idea of how prevalent teams are and how teams are so important in our organizations, is that a lot of times when we succeed individually, if we really think about it, there's probably a team element there that contributed to that success. So you give the example of when the Red Sox were playing the Phillies in September of 2015, and the center fielder, Mookie Betts, he had his amazing catch, right? And a lot of people were like, wow, amazing catch, great skills, etc. But then you break it down into all these different ways in which, somebody was actually telling him how far away from the fence he was so that he could, judge when he was going to jump, and all these types of things that went on team-wise and even culturally there. So I just think it really, again, highlights the complex nature of this and how teams are such an important part of our organizations.
Now, you didn't bring that up because, as a Red Sox fan, I'm disappointed that Mookie Betts went to the Dodgers and is playing in the World Series now, right? That's not why you told that story.
No, purely because it was in the book.
Yeah. Well, what I like to do is I'll show that clip of that play in corporate settings.
Yeah.
And the aha is, kind of this hidden teamwork factor that contributes to individual success. And when I say, if you reflect on individual successes in organizational settings, because there's so much interdependency, almost always there's someone that was doing something that enabled that to happen, even if it was simply taking care of work that that person normally did. So they were freed up to kind of really tackle this other problem in some ways. So it's that hidden teamwork piece that I think shows up in that story.
Yeah, yeah. Another myth that you talk about is how, oh gosh, I got to focus on this teamwork thing and make my teams better. This is just a distraction from actually getting stuff done. I've definitely heard that.
I've had clients use those exact words with me. We don't have time for teamwork. I have a business to run here, And I would say, in their defense, and I'm thinking about one particular example, in this leader's defense, he thought that teamwork was, let's go to the pub. Let's celebrate, Joe's birthday, right? And if you do think about teamwork that way, I understand it can be, perceived as a distraction. But if you think about teamwork as the way work gets done, right, then the data is really clear. And Jeff Lapine and his colleagues did a meta-analysis. Teams that demonstrate better teamwork outperform others by about 20 to 25%, right? But if the mindset is it's really this kind of other thing than from the way work gets done, I understand why people consider it to be a distraction. But that truly is a myth, right? It's really about fundamental work being accomplished collaboratively.
Sure. So, maybe we move a little bit and talk a little bit about the science of teams. So, in the book, which again, go out there and buy it. Don't be a jackwagon. Buy the book. You set this great framework all about teams, and then talking about the science of teams and some of the things that really matter. And you distill it down into these 7 different drivers. So, maybe we could talk about some of those drivers in, just kind of a little quick guide, perhaps, to some of those.
Yeah. So we like to refer to them as the 7 C's. So, capability, cooperation, coordination, communication, cognition, conditions, and coaching. And if you look at them in terms of the kind of the buckets, capability is, do we have the knowledge, the skills, the attributes on this team, those kind of stable traits that are needed to be successful? If you don't have that, you're not going to be successful. Sometimes people think they could team away huge talent gaps. And the reality is that only happens in the movies, right? The Bad News Bears somehow managed to win. But if I'm on a marketing team and we really need someone with international marketing expertise and no one on our team has that, and I don't bridge that gap, we can't team it away. We can't, our coordination isn't going to make up for that. So capability is one. Cooperation is about mindset. So things like trust and psychological safety and collective efficacy, all those things, it's mostly about how people think about their team. Really, really important. And then coordination is the classic behaviors. It's often what you think about when you think about teamwork. Are we backing up one another? Are we handling conflict well? Communication, that's about information exchange. And I would tell you that more often than not, when people come to us with a problem, they initially articulate it as a communication problem, even though very often that's just the symptom of something else that's going on, right? But communication both within the team and even outside the team, from a boundary spanning perspective.
One of the things from the book on the communication that I loved, it says communication doesn't mean just do it more often. You got to have the proper cadence, but it's got to be good content there.
Yeah. Again, if you think about these leaders that step forward and say, Scott, we have a communication problem on the team. So I'm telling them they need to communicate with each other more. We're holding more meetings. I'm asking them to do emails to each other to keep each other informed. There's an example of trying to tackle a communication problem by increasing quantity. And again, the research is very clear about this. It's about quality. It's not about quantity. In fact, high-performing teams often communicate less than low-performing teams, right? And they can because they have a shared mental model, which is about cognitions. But simply telling your team we need to talk more isn't the answer. In fact, what the research shows here is that it's about sharing unique information, right? Information that other people don't have. It's not just chatter, right? And it's about closed loop communication that is in a way of ensuring that we understand each other, right? So sometimes in this effort to try and get people to communicate more, you get a lot of noise in the system. And that's not what we're trying to accomplish here. We're trying to make sure that unique information is being shared.
Yeah.
So,
So, one thing you mentioned is this idea of being on the same page or having similar mental models. And, this kind of leads us into that next piece there, the next C, cognition, and having this shared understanding across the team members. If you could unpack that a little bit, what does it mean to have a shared mental model?
yeah. So if you were on a team, you and Chris and three other folks are on a team together, and I were to individually talk to you, and I would ask you questions like, so what's your team trying to accomplish right now? What are the biggest priorities? Who's responsible for task A? If a technical problem occurs during a podcast, right, what are we supposed to do about that? Right? Those would be examples. If people on your team gave me the same answer, I would say your team has a strong shared mental model. And one of the ones that's really important is about roles, because we know very clearly that when there's role conflict or role ambiguity, it creates problems on the team. So do we have a shared understanding about who is responsible, for what? Do we have a shared understanding about what's really important these days?
I mean,
That's
even
when
the
like
idea of role is a mental model.
it is.
Hey, HR handles this. Oh, but finance is its own thing. Oh, well, in our small organization, finance actually reports up through HR. Okay. So you're using the heuristic of a different mental model to get to a shared mental model space. The language matters, but it has different contexts, right? And just
Yeah.
even going through that process. I mean, Ben and I do this all the time with clients of like, how do you guys think about the way you do work? What is the language you're using? Hey, do you know that this guy has a different meaning for that word? Like scrum team,
Yeah.
agile, these kinds of newer paradigms for human organizing and project management. It's an ever expanding universe. And taking time to get on what do they say? The same sheet of music is time super well spent, because otherwise you're just talking past each other.
One of the cognitive biases that we see a lot is something I call everybody knows, right? So because I know this, I assume that you as my team members know this as well.
Mhm.
So I don't articulate it. And because I don't articulate it, we end up over time having different shared mental models.
Right.
And then when something comes up, either the ball gets dropped or we engage in a conflict because we had a different understanding about it in some way. The other thing, Chris, that you mentioned earlier in terms of roles is it is a construct, right? It is kind of a mental thing. And how do we think about our roles, et cetera? And when we have ambiguity, it creates problems. So sometimes what I see, though, is team members then go the complete opposite way. And they're like, we have to have everything mapped out. We need to know all the details. We need to know who's responsible for these, minute things. And it ends up with this very rigid definition of roles. And so what I like to tell them is there's a difference between role clarity and role rigidity.
Mm.
In fact, we could collectively agree that any one of the three of us could step in and take care of something. As long as we have a common understanding about that there's flexibility there, that's great, right? So it's not that everything has to be rigid. It's just that we have to be, use the term same sheet of music. We have to be on the same page, right? The same sheet of music.
Yeah, these mental models. And when you say stuff like that, I'm saying, what's going on in the culture here that somebody needs such a rigid definition? Is there punishment for stepping outside? It starts opening up. Maybe there's a broader organizational mental model or cognition that needs to be explored on a spectrum of healthiness here. Ben and I call it the Shawshank Redemption effect. We've been institutionalized, right? And it has the same thing to do with onboarding. When we bring new people into our organization, they come with a mental lineage of all the teams they've ever been on, all the organizations, the good, the bad, the ugly, as far as leadership. And they're bringing those mental models and briefcases to their job site, right? Hi, guys.
Yeah.
Here I am. Here's my briefcases full of mental models and stuff. You can alleviate a lot of that by spending time on the onboarding and having a bit of a disciplined process of saying, hey, let's talk about our mental models around here. And heck, maybe you've got something you can teach us about mental models where you're from.
Yeah, I think as humans, we arrive where we are honestly. We could be completely wrong, right? But it's based on our past experiences. We bring those with us. And if I'm bringing kind of a different historical background, it may be irrational in this current environment. I like to say, when I see someone who is acting irrationally, I ask the question, what would make it rational from their perspective? Because we humans don't do things irrationally on purpose. So why is that? So back to your point earlier, why is it that this leader is trying to handle all this by having tremendous rigidity, right? Well, it may be that that's the way things ran in their prior organization. They got punished for allowing any ambiguity. It may be that they lack the skills to lead. And so there's a discomfort that they have in being able to handle some of the flexibility. So their solution is, it's like raising kids. Let's make sure that everything is sketched out for the kids exactly, because I'm not comfortable kind of, leading my kids in some ways around this. So they come by it honestly. It's just dysfunctional, right? So this is where the education piece comes into play. And this is also where it's critical. You talked about onboarding, right? It's critical to start at the beginning with working to build shared mental models. But also it's something they change, conditions change. So the starting point is onboarding or when a team is formed, but then you have to pay attention to this on an ongoing basis. It's not like we can announce it once. Here's the rules of engagement, right? In the military, they establish rules of engagement, but as the combat situation changes, there's some adjustments that have to be made as well. And if you don't make adjustments, you're operating with outdated rules of engagement.
Yeah, it's like a therapy model. Everybody who's been to a therapy as an adult will have a therapist probably say, that was probably made sense when you were 14, but you're a grown person now. Maybe you need some different tools.
But again, if I don't have the tools to cope, then I fall back on kind of these other things. As a leader, if I'm not aware of what I need to do to maybe build shared mental models and deal with flexible roles, but having clarity about it, then my default is to let's just button this down and let me mandate and let me tell the team what to do. And we know from a research perspective that doesn't work well. But again, it's a default if you don't know what to do better.
Right. So you just brought up, leaders and leadership a little bit, and that's another kind of piece here in terms of these drivers of team effectiveness. You label it in the book, you call it coaching, and you talk about leadership behaviors. And what I really like here is that you say it's not just, the leader, quote unquote, who needs to do these things. It's much more of a, viewing leadership as, as I like to define it more as a social process of influence, where it really can be something that various people at different times are exhibiting these behaviors. I think that's a really helpful way to think about leadership in a team environment.
Yeah, I mean, if you accept the premise that in today's work, leaders can't see everything. I mean, first of all, now because people are working from home, but even before that, right?
They want to see everything, spying on the Zooms.
No, we got to be careful about seeing everything in the current environment.
Oh my gosh!
But leaders can't see everything. There's greater spans of control, which means they have more people reporting to them. We're dealing in more volatile, complex, changing environments, and so it's insufficient, right, to expect that the leader can see and do everything. Therefore, we need some other people on the team who at times will step up. And it's not we're not talking about a formal, let's appoint a second leader. It's just, everybody on the team can fulfill some leadership functions. And that includes things like, holding each other accountable. And if you accept the sports analogy for a second, the best teams, the locker rooms have players that are holding each other accountable. Having more seasoned people who are providing coaching and advice. And getting coaching from a peer is different than getting coached from your boss, who may be judging you and evaluating you. So it's really important in a team setting that there be times in which people step up and they demonstrate leadership behaviors, even though they're not necessarily a leader.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was thinking about soccer. I can't remember where the study was done, but everybody said, okay, well, there's tend to be a captain of the team. But then they did surveys of who was the real leader on that team. And it would inevitably emerge that maybe some third string player who might as well almost be a water boy ended up having so much referential power and influence and leadership within in that place that ultimately for the team, because despite the positional authority, right, that person was absolutely the leader of what was going on.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily the most talented person on the team, right? It's not like the star player should always get the C on their jersey, and that's kind of specific to sports. But there's these kind of hidden C's that exist in corporate settings, right? Like we kind of know over time who the captain of our team is, who's representing us in some ways, and we expect the leader to do that, and they should. But in addition to that, there are people who kind of informally fill that role. And as you said, Chris, if we interview people on the team, they could probably tell you, well, actually, Jane is she's kind of the glue that keeps things together here. And if any of us sort of, fall out of line, she's going to be the first person to tell us, hey, let's make sure we stay on path.
Yeah, I think that's great. Another thing that you mentioned that I like the way you phrase it in the book and kind of frame it and set it up is this idea that there are obviously different leadership styles or ways that we can view leadership. And you talk, for example, about transformational and shared, servant and civil leadership. But I like it how you frame these as perspectives that help to remind us to do certain things versus, this is the only way you should do things. Because sometimes I see people who come into leadership situations and say, well, my style is transformational and this is what I do. I inspire and then you go about and do your greatness, right?
You said that very inspirationally too.
Yes,
I have to point out.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, it's back to this rigidity issue, right, Ben? So, as a leadership guru, a person would come in and advocate the answer around this. Even I think there's a little bit of this in the research itself, where certain academic researchers have adopted kind of this is the type of leadership that matters, and the research is around that. In practice, I can't be purely transactional, right? I can't be purely transformational. What I have to do is kind of have fit for purpose. So understanding kind of the different leadership styles, understanding what my default is too, right? Because people have a natural tendency to default to a way they lead. One person tends to, every time that they don't think about it, they end up with this carrot stick approach, right? A transactional approach. Other people tend to be more transformational in nature, right?
Right.
But having kind of a palette of things that you can kind of tap into and have some flexibility, they serve different purposes.
Right.
Yeah, you're going to need different gears as a leader, right? Everybody, I can't go be, Mattis or Bill Gates or, as a computer nerd who played music as an undergrad who went in to be an infantry officer in the Army. I'd we'd be out there in the field. I'm like, everybody's got a six-pack but me. These guys look like Rambo, and I'm just like an IT weenie over here. I had to skin my leadership challenges different. I couldn't stand up there, my pectoral muscles shining like justice in the dawn, inspiring people to charge the field. That wasn't a gear I had.
So let me share some research that'll make you feel better. First of all, I'm sure everybody has that same exact career path that you described. It's very common.
Very common.
Nerd to infantry, I think, is the natural. So your path is unusual, right? But Australian Special Forces, some research was done there that I thought was really interesting. They wanted to know why some people succeed through this very rigorous training. Special forces in Australia are just like special forces all over the world. You guys know better than I do, right? Specialized, highly skilled, individually, competent, et cetera, all this, right? The number one predictor that they found in the Australian Special Forces for being successful was whether the person viewed themselves as a team player or not.
Wow.
Interesting, right? So, of course, none of them were completely out of shape, right? So the capability did come into play. But if they didn't view themselves as a team player, in that context, they weren't going to be successful. So for you to go into that, make that shift that you did, Chris, and end up in this other place, there's things that you can tap into other than being, the person with the best six-pack.
Yeah. And this is the message of hope that I want to send to leaders. Like if we learn anything from Hersey Blanchard, we can provide different types of leadership for different situations. And it doesn't need to only be telling, selling, participating, delegating. Hey, I really, it's a low point on the team. I feel like we can have some inspiration here. Well, I'm probably not going to be able to get up and do a equivalent of the I have a dream speech or some Churchill something. But, you can stand up there with authenticity and say, guys, I don't know what to say to inspire you right now, but I believe in us. I mean, it's something from the heart. This is the point. There's like gears. No, if you drive a stick shift, well, second gear is best, obviously. Well, no, you need all the gears, right? And when you're going 60 miles an hour, second gear is not the best. But we can dive into these, and you provide some examples and some checklists for people to think about. And that's what I want some people that, if you're wondering about buying this book, which we'll put the link in the show notes, he doesn't just leave you like, hey, this is a book on boxing, and these are all the moves, and have fun with that in the ring. There's actual pragmatic steps and checklists and questions that you can go on that internal soul searching journey so that you can get, we talked about cognitions and mental models. This is a cognition and mental model of teams itself. If you want to fix the teams that you're on, you got to have a lexicon, a set of words to talk about it with other people's, and a mental model to think about this holistically. Now, one of these things is leadership. And I think you provide a great view for how to look at leaderships on teams.
One of the other things that we see emerging from the research is the concept of servant leadership, right? And again, it's not that I am constantly wearing my servant leadership hat, but the best example that I can give here, and again, I apologize with another sports example, but does the leader view themselves as the quarterback of the team, and everybody around them is trying to make sure that they're successful and they're the next Tom Brady? Or does the leader view themselves as an offensive lineman, right, whose job it is to remove obstacles and open up holes so that other people on the team can be successful? And if you're not viewed at least part of the time, right, as an offensive lineman, as a servant leader, you are not going to see these above and beyond behaviors. You're not going to see the adaptation. You're not going to see people speaking up, unless you're viewed that way at least some of the time. And again, like we were talking earlier, it's not that I have to be in this role all the time, but it should be part of my repertoire. And in fact, Chris, as you were talking earlier, I was thinking, having the framework and the solution to improving a team, it needs to be fit for purpose. So the idea that I can have a team building exercise that will work in all situations, it doesn't make sense, right? One team is struggling because of a lack of capability. Another team is struggling because they don't have shared mental models. A third team is struggling because their communication with people outside the team is not working the way it's supposed to. Why would I expect the same solution to be able to boost the performance in those three situations? So it starts with even just stepping back and looking and saying, where are we strong and where are areas that we have needs, and then to be able to have some tangible things, some evidence-based actions you can take that match up against the need of your particular team.
Yeah. One thing that is really interesting about, having a tool set or a variety of different leadership techniques that you might use, or different roles, or even allowing for there to be some shared leadership in a team, is that it implies that if you are the formal authority, if you are the manager, the leader of the team in formal ways, you have to have, it seems, some humility, and you have to be able to kind of give up that control that seems to be kind of part of many people's mental model of what it means to be a leader sometimes.
Yeah. And so, unfortunately, some people equate creating an environment where people can speak up, right, where it's okay to have a point of view, as abdicating responsibility. Right? That's how some people view it. Again, it's an incorrect judgment, but you can see how they get there, right? And there's no reason why you can't be participative without abdicating responsibility. And there's times when you do need to be tough as a leader, and you have to make tough decisions, and you can do that respectfully. An example of this is, I was giving advice to a team recently, and a leader recently, and the conclusion after thinking through all of this is that his number two person on the team, the business and the position had outgrown him. And as a result, he was floundering. He was making the rest of the team miserable. He was personally unhappy. This guy, the number two guy, was personally unhappy. And for this leader to be successful, they had to change people on the team, right? So that's a tough decision. but how you go about making that decision, right? And how you first take steps to try and develop them, et cetera, how you engage the team in what you do in the aftermath. This isn't being a tyrant, right? But it's also okay to be able to create a participant environment without giving up all responsibility.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's very well said. And I think that maybe kind of moves us a little bit towards thinking about, and we can talk about some of the implications for the research that you talk about in your book for leaders and team members and for organizations. But first, one thing I'm curious about, because, in addition to writing this great book with Eduardo Salas, you obviously have consulted with many different organizations and teams over the years. I'm just curious, what are some of the best and worst teams you've ever worked with as a consultant? Just throwing a curveball at you because I think it's an
Yeah,
interesting
well,
thing that you've done.
so we've done some work with NASA over the years.
Hmm.
One thing that we know is they have a shared sense of purpose. They're trying to get people to Mars.
Yeah.
They're trying to get people to the moon. So some of the teams that we've worked with there obviously, would fall into the high, performing team category. I think one of the well-kept secrets in this country, you both have a military background. I think one of the well-kept secrets is leaders in the military at senior levels are every bit as good as the leaders I see in the C-suite in corporations. In part, I think there's an emphasis on leadership and development in the military that's great. So, there's a few military teams that we worked with, just really outstanding. The teams that we have seen that really struggled were teams where the leader did not create an environment for the team to be able to be open. I'm thinking of one, I obviously won't say who it is,
Sure.
but I'm thinking of one team where the leader had a subtle or sometimes not so subtle way of closing down team members. And the message they conveyed was, you, the team members, don't have much to say here. I want you to execute what I'm telling you to do.
Right.
And over time, we watched the team, in our involvement with them, we watched the team get less and less involved in things. And, try as we may to coach that leader, sometimes you're not successful in it. And that was a team that struggled and really failed ultimately in the project they were involved in.
Yeah. So I think that kind of, speaks to one of these implications that you talk about in the book for being an effective team leader, which is building that sense of psychological safety. So I think that's such an important piece, and I think it really is kind of a mini theme throughout the book. You talk about it in a variety of different ways, and I agree that the research shows that it's very important. Maybe you could unpack that a little bit in terms of how that operates for an effective team leader.
Yeah. So, first of all, let me just say, I think Amy Edmondson from Harvard has done some really good work in this space. Sure. So people who aren't familiar with it, grabbing some of her work, I think is great. But, psychological safety is me being able to be myself. And by being myself, it means things like, gee, I don't understand this. Can I raise my hand and say, hey, I don't understand this. I need help. Or I have a different point of view than my leader does, or the most seasoned person on the team does. Can I say that out loud? So those are examples of psychological safety. And I think we all know that the best teams aren't great on day one. They become great because they learn and they adapt over time. And if team members aren't comfortable speaking up and acknowledging when they have problems and asking questions and things like that, there's no way that team is going to be able to adjust over time. And the research is interesting. Clearly leader behaviors matter a lot, as do peer behaviors. But, leader behaviors, there's a few things that leaders can do that can make a huge difference. I mean, one thing is, as a leader, if I can acknowledge that I don't know something, it makes it easier for other people to acknowledge them.
Right.
If I can talk about things that I'm going to be better at, I need to get better at, and I'm working on it, other people can acknowledge that as well. When someone offers a dissenting point of view in a team setting and I'm the leader, and I think they're wrong, the key way to respond to that is to be able to thank them for the input, right? And to be able to say, I'm glad you brought that up. And I have a different perspective about this, so let's talk about that in some way. I think the other thing that leaders need to do that sometimes you don't read about in the psychological safety literature is that they need to establish boundaries, right? They need to be clear about negotiables and non-negotiables. So I'll give you an example of something that we saw in a team not too long ago. So team leader does a good job, brings his team together, asks about problems and challenges that they have, and an issue about the system, the new system they're using has a bug in it. So a person brings it up, can't do anything about it. Every meeting, this person brings up the bug in the system. And finally, the leader closes this person down, and the rest of the team shuts down, not just about that, but about everything. And the reason that happened is because the leader didn't specify kind of the boundaries, right? So if the leader were to say, okay, we're all working with this new system. I know it's challenging, but I think in the long run, we're going to end up with better work performance because of this. Now, there's a few things that we can't do anything about right now. I've been told, any bug fixes are going to be on hold for the next 6 months. So when we find those, let's figure out if we can work around them, but it makes no sense for us to spin our wheels on this. On the other hand, the way we're using this function in the system, I'd really like your input on this. And if you have ideas about how we should be communicating with our customers for the use of this, wide open. Now, when that person says during the meeting, hey, I think these bugs are really making us crazy here. We've got to do something about it. The leader is in a position to be able to say, as you know, that's one of those things that we agreed was off limits because we can't do anything about it. So let's not spin our wheels there. But I'd be very interested in your take about how we can work around this. Right? So there's another way in which we can build psychological safety. And interestingly, earlier when we talked about role clarity plays a huge role in psychological safety. Because if you and I both think we're responsible for something, and you do it, and I see you doing it, I'm gonna be upset about that. Mm-hmm. Or if you and I both think the other person is responsible for this, right? There's going to be role ambiguity, and things will drop through the cracks. But when I step up to do something, and because the roles are unclear, I step on your toes, and you close me down, I'm done. I'm going to stick just to my little box of what you told me to do. I'm not stepping outside at all. So I think psychological safety is a really big deal. The good news is it doesn't require a personality change on the part of the leader.
Right.
There's a few key behaviors that can really promote it in some ways. Mm-hmm. And I think all leaders should be kind of exposed to that.
Well, I think it's great, like when we talk about mental models and cognition, like that idea of role confusion. Hey, no need to get mad here. Let's keep talking. Looks like it was a little bit of role confusion here. No worries. Let's talk about these roles. Great. Let's move on. And you just turn that same conflict around just because you have a mental model and some words to use to describe what's happening.
Yeah. And, during conflict, we can approach it multiple ways, right? So when we have that conflict, is this, let me convince you why I need to be in charge of this and my solution is the best solution, right? So, I'm from New York and I see a lot of that kind of, let me push my idea, right? It's part of our New York culture around this. And then I'll go to a meeting in the Midwest where there tends to be a little bit nicer culture. And when something like that happens, people often don't speak up, right? Until we get in the hallway. And then people are talking about, can you believe, what Mary did there?
Oh my gosh, right.
But the best teams and research on conflict shows engage in collaborative conflict, right? So having that language, Chris, that you alluded to, that allows us to have collaborative conflict. And collaborative conflict, if I cut through all of it, it's not about who's right, it's about what's right. And having a language to reframe it so we can talk about what's right and what we need to go forward, regardless of how things have been, regardless of how we got to where we are. Like, what's best here? May the best idea win. That's a healthy place to be.
Right. Those are some great tips, I think, for any leader who's trying to make their team more effective. And there's a number of other really great ones in the book. Let's turn our attention now maybe to how can you as an individual, say you don't have the formal authority, you're not in charge of the team, but what can you do to be a good teammate if you're in that situation?
So it's funny, at a very fundamental level, it starts with living up to commitments. We know trust is important. We know trust gets formed through a couple of judgments. One judgment is whether I believe you have the ability to deliver on what you say. And the second is, do I think your values and your integrity are good? And particularly when a team gets formed, I don't know you, right? So until this point, I have some assumptions about you, maybe based on other people that did your type of work previously. So one fundamental way of being a good team member is to live up to commitments. And one good way to live up to commitments is not to make commitments to things that you can't control, right? I'd rather a team member or a team leader say, that's interesting. My commitment to you is I'm going to research this and get back to you and let you know what's feasible, rather than saying, I will take care of that if it's something that's completely out of their area of control. So that's one thing. Fundamental. Any team that you're on, I think it can start with being careful about the commitments you announce and living up to the ones that you do. The second is, good team members demonstrate backup behavior. Right? We fill in for one another. Any of us that have been on teams for a while know there's like someone on the team who's always willing to help out. And so to be a good team member is to ask, can I help?
Mm-hmm.
Now, once we have really good shared mental models, sometimes that help can happen without even talking about it. I watched a restaurant crew, in a kitchen where they were just taking care of each other's plates without even saying anything. They had this kind of, your sauce is smeared badly on the plate. You don't notice it. They reach over and they take their napkin and they clear it before it gets delivered, right? But until we get there, what good team members do is they speak up and say, hey, can I help you in some way? And then a third one that comes to mind is, who are you representing when you're interacting with people outside the team? Look, I understand we need to do some self-promotion. I'm not against that. Hey, I have a book out. Did you hear about that? It's really good. So self-promotion is fine. But if as a team member, the only thing I talk about when I'm outside the team is me, and I don't talk about my team, and I'm not trying to garner resources for my team, A, it doesn't help my team, and B, it's not great for building my reputation within the team. So those are a few, fundamental things, along with caring more about what is right than who is right.
Excellent advice there. Now, if you kind of go up the organizational chart, so to speak, and if you're talking to a senior leadership team, and in terms of what they can do as an organization or as senior leaders themselves, what are some things maybe they could do a little differently to encourage good teams and good teamwork within their organizations?
Yeah, we do a lot of work with senior leadership teams, and if you think about them, first of all. They don't work shoulder to shoulder every day. They're not like a manufacturing team. By definition, they're diverse because they represent different functions or regions or parts of the business.
Right.
Which means they speak different language to begin with. You talk finance and I talk marketing language, right? So it's not easy for them. Let me first start with that. All senior leadership teams struggle a little bit. But sometimes they have the false impression that what they're doing goes unseen. It's happening behind closed doors. It's on the 32nd floor.
Right.
It's only in our boardroom. And there's some really interesting research that comes out of the Netherlands that really dispels that. In that particular study, they looked at 60 plus senior leadership teams. And what they found is in senior leadership teams where there's collaborative behavior, backup behavior, in other words, they are working well together. Those organizations show higher engagement levels of employees. And they show higher retention levels of employees. Think about that, right?
Wow.
What goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas, but what goes on in the senior leadership team meeting doesn't stay there. It somehow permeates through the organization in some way. So the first piece of advice I give to senior leaders is first check yourselves, right? First make sure that your team is working well together. Occasionally do debriefs where you talk about how you're working together as a team and where there have been disconnects in some ways. Because if you don't have your own house in order, it's hard to be able to send the cultural norms. The second thing is I ask them, so what do you communicate about in the organization? Reflect on the kind of the written and the verbal and the town halls and the things that you've done. And when you tell stories that involve success, is it always Mookie Betts made an amazing catch on his own? Or when you tell the stories, do you talk about how Jackie Bradley was also calling out the distance to the fence in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
If your stories are always about individual excellence, the hero who overcame all odds, right? The message you're sending in the organization is lone wolves are what we need here. And in fact, that's probably not the case. So make sure that you're telling stories that also illustrate collaboration and teamwork, particularly across functional boundaries in some ways. And then the third thing is, insist on a review of the policies and practices and systems in the organization. One thing that's definitely true is if you show me who is being promoted in your organization, I can tell you whether you are building a culture of collaboration or not.
Right.
The last 20 promotions, these are all individual selfish people, but they were generating revenue. Everybody hated them. They stepped on other people to get to the top. What's the message you're sending? So what are your promotion practices? And what are your onboarding practices? Is there discussion about teamwork and collaborative norms in the organization? You talked about onboarding earlier here. And then I think this is true both for direct line managers as well as senior managers. Let's think about who's coming into our organization, both in terms of making sure we select the right people, but also the message that we send. So I've watched organizations where on the front end, the interview process really focused on technical stuff. Can you program in Python? Can you give me an example of that? Can you show me how you can fix this technical issue? But if they don't talk about teamwork and collaboration and working with one another, the message that we're sending to that person we're hiring is all that matters here is technical expertise, right? And not collaborative behavior. And you also end up with a deficit of people who have what we refer to as collective orientation, right? Who tend to think team first. So, if we borrow from the interview literature and think about the use of behavioral event interviews or things like that, we should be asking questions like, so tell me about a time when you were on a team and that team struggled. What did you do? What did you think? How did you handle this? What happened? And one of the telltale signs is when you talk about these multiple team experiences, when the story that the person gives is always, I knew what to do, but these idiots didn't do it. You found somebody who probably has toxic traits that are going to be a problem, right?
Yeah.
So last thing I'll say here is we can't tolerate toxic behavior. We did work with a retail organization, and I give senior leadership credit, where they introduced a certification program that included the fact that their salespeople would participate in collaborative behaviors like handling returns, backing up one another, et cetera. And when they introduced this program, it started working really well. And one of the most experienced, high revenue generating salespeople in the organization said, I shouldn't have to do this. I've been doing this work for 20 years. I bring in all this money. I shouldn't have to do this stuff. And to senior leadership's credit, what they said to him was, we love the work that you do. We're confident that you can pass the certification process. We will help make sure that you understand the guidelines on that. But if you choose not to play, thank you, you're gone. And that story made its way through the organization. Like, we're committed to collaborative behavior. So that's the other thing. It's like you think about these stories and these examples that all of a sudden get spread through the organization. Are they about working together, crossing functional boundaries, being a team player? Or are they always about the hero?
That's excellent. That's excellent. So, we've covered so much ground here, and I think you've provided such great insights, and certainly there's more in the book. One thing that we're curious too is, right now we're recording this in the midst of COVID and all the related shenanigans with that. Any advice for teams in this particular moment, working more distributively and so forth?
Yeah. So, first, let's acknowledge that it's a difficult time for everybody.
Yeah.
Right? The good news, incidentally, is I'm actually seeing some more humanizing behavior as we have our cameras open and we see the families and the places where people work in the homes, which is great. But from a team perspective, distance creates a challenge, right? When we're co-located, there's more natural ways for us to be able to communicate informally, to share our point of view, to build shared mental models. When we are working remotely, there's less opportunities for that to happen naturally. So I think the best way of building team effectiveness is through team debriefs. This is true whether you're co-located or not, right? Chris Sarasoli and I published a meta-analysis that showed that teams that debrief systematically over time outperform other teams by almost 25%. Simple, it's not expensive, teams should be doing it. But if you think about it, in remote settings, that becomes even more important because we're not getting the day-to-day, the daily interaction to enable us to kind of sustain a shared mental model and to make adjustments. So one thing is conduct remote debriefs and be sure that when you do them, you're not just talking about task work. Right? Did we get progress on this item in the project? But also talk about teamwork. Hey, is there anybody that should have been notified sooner about this? Is there any other people we need to bring in to engage in this to make sure we have the right talent? Are we clear how the priorities have changed recently? Right. So that's one thing, definitely that. The second is we've talked about role clarity a good bit, during this podcast, But in this case, I think it becomes even more important that we have clarity about decision-making authority, right? Because what happens is that I'm now working from home and I'm not in the same room with my boss and I can't check with them easily. And I certainly don't want to be having to send them a note every single time. So where is their local discretion? Individually, I can run with this. And what are things that we need to bring back to the leader or bring back to the team in some way? And I think teams that are doing well in this environment currently have had some conversations about that and a little greater clarity, which gives me autonomy when I need it, but also means I'm not stepping on landmines inappropriately. The other thing is about response time, right? So research shows that faster response time is better, right? But more importantly than speed of response time is a shared understanding about response time. So it's great if we can all be responding within an hour, but if that's a false expectation, let's not have that. If you think 48 hours is an appropriate response time, and I think 4 hours is, and I'm sending you stuff and you're not responding, man, I'm burning up,
yep.
Right? So we need to have an understanding in these kind of remote teams, what's an appropriate response time on this?
That's excellent.
And if you're forming a team, right? One of the first inclinations that people will do with remote teams when they're forming them is to want to start with personal stuff. Okay, let's go around the room and tell us, what your hobbies are and if you have any kids and what you're doing in life and what your background is. And I would say don't start there. Starting there emphasizes differences, right? And it emphasizes where there may be fault lines. Oh, Ben's an engineer. I know. I've always had problems with engineers. If instead we start with, hey, let's be clear about what the goal is, why we're formed together. Remember, you asked me about what a team is.
Mm-hmm.
A team has at least some shared, focus. So what is that? Secondly, let's talk about the tasks that need to be done. Let's talk about the roles that need to be filled, etc. Once we do that, and that's a common understanding, then it's great to understand what we each bring to the table and who we are. But I think a common mistake is to start with, let's get to know each other. And that's not great with remote teams. And if I could say something, you talked about virtual, but let me also say something about COVID,
mm-hmm.
right? Because we're living in a COVID world and we've been working with healthcare teams in this space. And I think there's something that we've seen with them that I think also has implications for others. But, they are doing heroic work. It is really difficult. They have to work as a team. And they're being put in a situation where they're having to work in areas that they may not have been fully trained in, with people that they may not have been working with previously, to tackle problems that they have not had to tackle before. And that's not the only place that happens, but it's really evident there. And of course, because of that, their performance at times isn't what they're accustomed to. And in their case, when that happens, they see patients die. So the natural inclination is to do problem solving. And problem solving is good. We should be doing problem solving. But if we are only doing problem solving, if we're only looking at what's failing, we're only looking at where there's mistakes, what happens is the team loses collective efficacy. Collective efficacy is not that I believe I can be successful, but it's that I believe our team can be successful. And that's something that drives team effectiveness. So one of the things that we've been encouraging them to do is to, in addition to their problem solving, also take a look at some of the successes. This patient that we thought was going to die actually lived. How do we do that? And what can we learn from that we can extend elsewhere? So it's a dramatic example in the medical world, but the same thinking applies, I think, in corporate settings. If we're focused simply on problem solving and always focusing on mistakes, teams lose collective efficacy.
Yeah, you don't have to go to the pub, guys, and have a birthday party. Well, you shouldn't be going really to the pub at this point. But, all of that stuff, we're trying to capture that efficacy, right? And that can just be, I think that's just so well said, just by focusing on the things that are going well in the world of work where you're at, as well as the problem-solving stuff.
That's right.
I mean, you'll notice a recurring theme is that almost all the things I'm talking about is about how work gets done, right? So it's not simply, kind of like, do I feel good in some ways? And one of the myths about that we see a lot is, man, if we could only get our team to like each other, if only we got along, then everything would be great. And Google even hypothesized that might be one of the predictors. And in their big study of teams, they found that wasn't a factor at all. psychological safety was number one for them, which is kind of interesting. So, it's about how work gets done, not necessarily, Chris, do I know your hobbies or not? And so, it's okay to do the picnic or the birthday parties post COVID, those things. I just want people to have realistic expectations about what they'll accomplish, right? And help a little bit maybe from some camaraderie, but it's not going to resolve a role clarity problem, a lack of shared mental models, insufficient talent on the team, any of those sorts of things.
That's right. I have not seen any research support that's for the idea that just getting all your employees together and doing trust falls all day is going to really do much for your teams. So,
outward bound. I mean, look, if as long as you realize this is about the team having, and I was going to say a fun experience, fun for the people who are able to climb really well, not so much fun for the rest of us, right? Yeah. It might be a fun experience and people, might enjoy the day, but just don't expect that will take on the problems that we often see associated with the 7 C's. Right?
Excellent. Scott, this has just been a fantastic conversation and just a wealth of information here. Where else can people find out more about you and what you're up to on the web?
Yeah, so a couple of places. For the book itself, if people go to www.teamsthatwork.com, there'll be some background information about the book and a little bit about Ed and myself. My company website is groupoe.com, so people can certainly find me there. And, I am on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Nice.
As is, much of the world. So that's another place that people can find out more about some of the things we're working on.
Outstanding. And of course, we'll put all of those links in the show notes so people can easily access those. So anything else that you want to share about teams or anything about industrial organizational psychology or the world of work at large?
Yeah, so maybe 2 things. One, in terms of my pitch. My pitch is to people, please do more team debriefs. They're easy. They're not expensive. And they don't have to be elaborate. And we shouldn't do them just after there's been a big failure in the organization, because otherwise everyone thinks this big hot wash after action review is to place blame for people. Get in the habit of periodically huddling up, pausing, reflecting on what we're doing, what's gone well, what hasn't gone well. Pick 1 or 2 things that we could do differently and get back to work. And if you do that on an ongoing cycle as a team leader, you will see benefits in your team. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just, I say, I am fortunate that I chose to be an IO psychologist. It's not like anybody when they're 4 years old and they say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" They don't say, "I want to be an IO psychologist."
They should.
Right? They should, of course. I mean, astronaut, fireman. No, IO psychologist, damn it. But I for me, it's really a great place to work, and it's awesome to be able to be in a field where we're dealing with really interesting challenges with people at work. And remember, people spend at least half their waking hours of their life at work to be able to figure out how they can have better experiences and how businesses can be more successful. I'm an advocate for IO psychology.
Outstanding. Well, our guest today has been Scott Tannenbaum, and we talked all about teams. We talked about his book, Teams That Work. And, I just want to thank you, Scott, for being part of the Indigo podcast.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Appreciate the invitation.
Thanks for listening to the Indigo podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.